TDM Productions.
Vocational education in prison. Vocational education in prison is a very popular evidence-based program that is used in many correctional institutions. Not only is it popular, but inmates that participate are less likely to return to prison and more likely to find work once they are released back into the community. Many of prisoners in correctional institutions lack the education needed to acquire and hold on to a job. In fact, up to 89% of those who return to prison are unemployed. Oftentimes, due to lack of income and options, many feel that crime is the only choice one has. With so many studies showing vocational education in prison lower the recidivism rate, but is also one of the biggest and most common form of evidence-based program that is seen in today's corrections. The earliest forms of vocational education in prison was present after the Three Prisons Act was passed in 1891. The act not only established the first 3 prisons, but also allotted $100,000 to each institution to create workshops for the unemployment program for inmates. Vocational programs are run generally by the Federal Bureau of Prisons and have different names from state to state. An example of one of these programs is located in Monroe Correctional Complex in Monroe, Washington. Inmates are able to attend vocational classes as part of prison's reintegration program, otherwise known as RAPP. Another good example of vocational education programs is FCI Petersburg. They offer their inmates classes in carpentry, plumbing, pottery, and other real-world jobs that they could do as soon as they leave correction. The short-term cost of these programs ranges from about $1,500 to $2,000 per inmate. However, the long-term savings ranges from $8,000 to $10,000. The studies show that vocational education in prison cuts recidivism rates by a substantial amount. In 2005, a little under 1,000 offenders were studied from a prison in Ohio. All of these inmates participated in vocational training, and 19% were less likely to reoffend and return to institution. Those inmates who complete their vocational training and receive diploma of some sort are less likely to be reincarcerated than those who merely just participated but failed to complete the course. A study in Virginia looked at 3,000 offenders who had been released from prison. The study showed that those who had participated in the program but failed to complete the entirety of the course were 24% less likely to be reincarcerated. However, for those who completed the course in its entirety, were 57% less likely to reoffend. With 50,000 inmates being released yearly, the need for rehabilitation is greater than ever. Social disorganization theory stems from social structure theory, the modern-day version of an older theoretical framework called the structural functionalist perspective. Social disorganization, in a few words, states that rather than a person's individual characteristics like age, gender, or race causing one to reoffend, suggests that the neighborhood itself and its subcultures cause an individual to reoffend. An individual who comes from a disadvantaged neighborhood with very little progress in the way of education has a greater risk of reoffending due to the lack of knowledge and skill sets to use in a workplace setting. This points out that lower education levels are presenting among offenders because many prisoners had role models who had low education levels. This can leave an individual without income or means to survive, forcing one to turn to reoffending. When prisons implement these vocational education programs, it allows the individual to have the opportunity to obtain the knowledge needed to return their communities and be successful. This not only gives the offender the ability to obtain a job, but also keep it, and slowly changing the community subculture by having new role models who are educated put back into those communities. However, some offenders are not immediately ready to be put back into the communities from which they came. Once released from prison, because of the close contact with peers who have criminal behavior, aftercare is just as important as the programs in prison. If an offender is able to go to a community where the peers in that community focus on legal behavior, the ex-inmates have a better chance of not reoffending. The main goal of corrections that is highlighted in vocational education programs in prison is rehabilitation. These programs focus on giving the offenders skill sets through education, with the ultimate goal being that they will return to their communities and have a positive impact. These programs allow the convicted offender to restore themselves into a constructive place within society. There are a great deal of studies on vocational education in prison, and all show positive numbers and evidence-based proof that it slashes recidivism rates. This is more than enough positive feedback to keep these programs up and running. However, the studies say that these numbers could exponentially be higher if these programs would extend into the offender's aftercare. Many offenders return home from prisons with these new skill sets and no knowledge as to how to apply them in a real-world setting. Finding jobs for ex-inmates can be a difficult task, even for those with education. This is why many ex-offenders find themselves turning to criminal activity to provide for themselves. If programs would only extend to aftercare, they could provide assistance in finding jobs, housing, and would have a positive impact on the community as a whole, and would ensure that they had the means to survive without committing crime. The United States has switched back and forth between focusing on punishment and rehabilitation, oftentimes swaying from side to side along with political parties. Many prisons in the U.S. are built and ran to focus their efforts on punishment versus working to rehabilitate the offender. Both have their positive and negative aspects, but only one provides a method of decreasing prison population and crime rates. Many officials fear of being thought of as soft on crime, so they fail to provide political support for rehabilitative communities and opportunities and advancements in these programs. Much of the public fails to realize that the majority of prisoners will one day return to society. A great deal of public support exists in educating our prison population. Many of those that disagree with this form of evidence-based vocational programs is because of the use of the taxpayers' dollars to fit the bill. The cost of these programs and the proper staff to see that it is being implemented properly can be costly. However, if one looks at the long-lasting effects of the program's success and how it would only save more money by reducing prison populations, it makes sense. The prison does what it can to prepare the offender for having success once released from prison. It gives them skill sets to obtain and keep jobs. If the offender is able to climb over the hurdle of being labeled as an ex-criminal, I was able to speak to an ex-criminal who served 5 years in federal penitentiary and completed about 10 years of parole. While incarcerated, he participated in a vocational education program in which received a certificate. When asked what the most interesting class he participated in, he said that it was when he passed the private pilot's written exam. I also asked how the program had impacted his life, and out of prison, had he responded with how the program wanted, and was it beneficial? And even though he did not continue on to become a pilot or a pottery maker, the skills he learned while participating in these prison vocational programs helped not only after his incarceration, but also by keeping him motivated while in prison and gave him hope. I asked him the process of finding employment once he was released. He responded that he was fortunate enough to have a father who owned a private flower shop in Miami. He said, however, many of his prior friendships had to be ended due to their criminal activity. He spoke of how difficult this transition was and how he was fortunate enough to have a strong-willed family to stay by his side through thick and thin. I asked him if he knew any other offenders who also went through these programs but returned to prison later on. He told me that not everyone is fortunate enough to have such a strong family to lean on, and that cutting ties with your previous life is an extremely difficult task, and many fail. Reading about these programs' work and looking at statistics gives us a good idea on how these programs affect prisoners. But to sit down and ask someone who went through the system and has been able to turn their lives around is a fantastic thing. As learned from this story, the battle to not reoffend and to stay out of prison is more difficult than most people think. It requires more than just strong will. At some point, someone has to look past these ex-prisoners label and help them along the way. This is easier said than done, but if these vocational education programs help the offender through aftercare, it would better their chances of building a life for themselves outside of prison. Oftentimes, the public's opinion can be shifted by a program participant reoffending even though everything was done correctly. And this is just something that will happen and will always be evident in this field. But if the programs aren't kept up with and updated through evidence-based finding, the prison populations will continue to rise, along with reoffending rates.